Hi, it's Travis White with the Persuasive Communication Tip of the Week. In a previous video, I talked about Robert Cialdini's book called Influence. And Cialdini identifies 6 principles by which we influence each other in our social behavior. Today, I'd like to talk about one of those, the Reciprocity Principle. Fundamentally, it's pretty simple. I do you a favor, you do me a favor. According to Cialdini, every society in the world adheres to this principle. It's very useful in developing and organizing a society. And you can think of a number of examples like this. We feel obliged to return a favor. I know my grandfather, when you did something nice for him, sometimes he'd say thank you. More often he'd say much obliged. In Portuguese, muito obrigado. The same idea. I'm obliged to you, you've done a favor for me. This is very important in persuasive communication. If we can do a favor for someone, oftentimes that favor is returned. There's 3 subtleties to this rule that I want to talk about today. One subtlety is simply that you don't have to request a favor in order to invoke the reciprocity principle. If I do something for you even though you haven't requested it, if I do a favor for you even though you haven't requested it, the reciprocity principle is invoked, and you feel some sense of obligation to return that favor. The second subtlety is that this lasts a long, long time, very much like the emotions that we've talked about before. And so, for instance, early in my career, there were people who were older and more senior than I who did favors for me and helped me establish and helped me get established in my career. Now, many years later, I'd be happy to return the favor. Not that they need some help in their career, but perhaps their children do. And because of something they had done many years ago, I'd be happy to return the favor for their children today. So this is more like an emotion. It lasts for a long time. And the last one is that concession is a form of a favor. And this comes up sometimes in negotiations. And so I state a position, you state a position, I concede, I back off, and then I would expect the reciprocity rule to be invoked, and I would expect a concession from you in return. So this is something we often find in a negotiation. And I'll give you a quick example of how I use that in my personal life. When I was in high school, I worked through high school, and I really wanted to buy a little sports car. I didn't think my parents would allow me to do that. I was only 17 at the time. So I worked on the principle of negotiation and reciprocity. And so one night at dinner, I announced to my parents, I think I'm going to buy a motorcycle. And I started reading motorcycle magazines. I started visiting motorcycle dealerships. And I'd ask my dad questions like, well, gee, Dad, do you think I should get a Harley or should I get a Triumph? And I was driving him crazy, I could tell. After several weeks of that, I said to them, I said, you know, motorcycle may not be very practical. So maybe I should get a small sports car instead. Would that be okay? And they immediately agreed. So I had made a negotiating position, the motorcycle. Then I had made a concession, and I expected my parents to make a concession as well, which they readily did. If I had started with asking for a sports car, I would have had nothing to concede, nothing to back off to. So this is much like we saw in the very first video. We talked about the principle of concession and shift. You make a concession in the present tense and shift to the future tense. This is very much similar to that in the sense of reciprocity. I do you a favor, you do me a favor. I give a concession in a negotiation, you should give a concession as well. It's social behavior, it's expected behavior, it almost forms a sense of obligation, and it certainly forms a basis of our societal development. So that's the Persuasive Communication Tip of the Week. See you again next week.